Welcome back to the Chinese-Jewish Conversation with Debby Lee and Rebecca Zami, and our subject is comparing ancient Chinese archaeology with ancient biblical archaeology. And one of the issues that came up in our discussions was something that you guys both found in common, because both of you have unique perspectives as insiders and outsiders and are looking back at a heritage with which you have a meaningful relationship, and you're invested in it, but at the same time you have a scientific perspective as archaeologists. One of the things that came up in our discussions was the duality that both of you have as insiders invested in Chinese and biblical culture, but at the same time you're trained as archaeologists who engage in scientific study. So I was wondering if you could comment on that tension or that duality. So Debby, let's hear your thoughts on this.
I feel like that insider-outsider perspective definitely gives me both advantages and disadvantages. From when I'm doing textual research from secondary sources that other scholars have already published, I can read in both languages and have a basic sense of the historical context that I'm reading about in order to understand multiple perspectives and help me in writing a more, I don't want to say objective, but a more definitely well-rounded argument or perspective, depending on what I write. But when I'm out in the field or actually interacting with modern Chinese scholars right now who are really in this field of work, I feel like my historical context, historical backing, sometimes is not enough for me to really grasp what they're saying in the moment. So I need to kind of go back and look over the history and understand that. So it's a double-edged sword for me.
Okay, thank you. And Rebecca?
I definitely agree with Debby that there are both advantages and challenges to being on both sides of the debate. There's the advantage of being well-read, well-versed in the text. So in my case, it's the Bible. There are advantages to it, like the example of the prominent Israeli archaeologist Eilat Mazar, who actually used the Bible to find out where she should be digging and was successful in her approach to archaeology using the text. There are also disadvantages. Some of the challenges in coming from being a part of the tradition and also trying to approach it from a scholarly point of view happens when maybe some of the finds don't really correlate with what the tradition teaches, and archaeologists have a lot of challenges there trying to explain to their readers what exactly is happening in history and how we are supposed to look at historical documents and how to correspond with archaeological finds.
Well, you know, that's certainly one of the challenges of archaeology. I think, you know, speaking as a professor of Jewish studies, in academic Jewish studies, the whole issue of the definition of our graduate school, the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, is the tension between being people who are invested in our religious heritage and our religious tradition, and we have a great deal of respect for our texts, and at the same time studying them historically and studying them scientifically, because the results are not exactly what the traditional narrative has. At the same time, we also believe that one of the values of Judaism is truth, and to accept the truth from wherever it comes. One of the most interesting things I learned from your lecture, Debby, was that people who are not archaeologists tend to think that archaeology is an objective science, and it proves or disproves things. And what you showed, I think, quite convincingly, is that archaeology, like many other things, is subject to interpretation. And so there are perspectives. If someone is coming from within a traditional perspective, they're going to look at the evidence in a certain way. So I thought that was very profound, the way that you brought that up within the Chinese tradition. I was wondering if you had any further thoughts on that.
So in the actual excavations, one of the most important things out in the field is directly interpreting the evidence already when you see it, when it's coming out from the ground. at each step you kind of have to interpret and determine the next step and the method that you should dig in. And even that step itself is very much open to interpretation. And one of the most important things that we have to face in archaeology is the idea of experience and how that dictates or experience and precedent, and how that dictates the way that digging should go. And sometimes experience shouldn't determine everything, because each new feature, each new artifact that you dig up is something new. It's never going to be the same as something that we've seen before. So in essence, we really should take in the multiple perspectives and not have experience dictate everything that we dig, because it will be continuously interpreted, continuously documented, and that document is going to be interpreted differently by other scholars who come in with different traditions. So it's important from the very beginning, from the get-go, at the excavation, to realize and acknowledge that our interpretations will determine how we document and excavate.
Now, one last question. We've been talking about antiquity, we've been talking about the Middle Ages, but we all of us work within a family circle, within a family situation, and from what our previous conversations, it's clear to me that both of you have families that are invested in one way or another with the kinds of studies that we've been discussing. And so, Rebecca, let me start with you. I found out recently that your grandfather is Rabbi Moshe Shammah, who is an important rabbinic figure in Brooklyn, in the Syrian community. And I've met him and I've corresponded with him. I've read his commentary on the Bible. And so I was wondering, if you could say a little bit more about him and what it was like to speak with him about your studies.
Well, my grandfather, during his rabbinic study, also studied at Loyola College, so he constantly had this duality of perspectives, which we spoke about a little bit earlier. He also, growing up, my mother always spoke about how they had Biblical Archaeology Review magazine in his house and Scientific American magazine in his house. So both fact and faith were very important to him, which helped me gain this kind of dual perspective that we spoke about earlier in approaching the archaeological finds with both the scientific point of view, but also the traditional and textual point of view that has helped me interpret the finds that we have brought out of our excavation in a very new way.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And Debbie, let me ask you, similarly, I know a little bit less about your family, but I do know from corresponding with your dad that your grandfather was an inspiration for him to study ancient China and to study archaeology. And what was it like? Have you spoken with him about, with your grandfather, with your father about this? And can you share a little bit more of the details of your family and your interaction with them on the basis of your studies?
So my grandfather, unlike Rebecca's grandfather, is not much of a very scholar in today's terms. He hasn't really studied systematically about all these ancient cultures, but he's definitely always been an inspiration. He was a teacher in China before different cultural events like the Cultural Revolution happened that caused him to kind of stop his teachings. But both my dad and my grandfather are both more well-versed in the historical side rather than the archaeological side. But my dad is he's very knowledgeable on Chinese bronzes and jades from also prehistoric times. So I feel like I definitely have more of a conversation with him in terms of this perspective, the archaeological perspective. But with my grandfather, he is so knowledgeable on the historical side. He's still reading commentaries on Chinese literature, which I fail to understand, unfortunately, but I'm still seeking his advice on this part. So they give me different perspectives, and I'm very lucky to still be able to work with them and talk to them about these different things.
Do you ever share with your grandfather what you write? I mean, you said you learn from him, but do you ever bring him something that you've written?
Definitely. I definitely share with him my own insights and arguments, and maybe from some previous papers that I've written or what I'm working on currently. And he doesn't try to kind of negotiate or anything with, because maybe he himself has not studied the very specific things that I have studied. But it's interesting because sometimes I talk to him one day and then 2 or 3 days later he'd bring me a book on something he read or like an article he found on this subject, and he was like, oh, maybe this will be helpful for you. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but it's interesting to see that he would like to learn more about this and catch up with both modern and new ancient sources that are coming up right now. So I like to see my grandfather doing that.
Sure. And well, Rebecca, do you ever bring your stuff to your grandpa?
Definitely. I was just working on a new find that came out of Samaria, a gold necklace or diadem, and I had a lot of conversations with him and other rabbinic figures in my life who had very different insights than I did. I could tell the dynamic that I had a very technical point of view, a very historical point of view, and they introduced the textual and religious interpretations that might actually fit with the piece that I had not considered. So I am definitely fortunate to have both aspects of my life in my family and in my teachers. So I'm very grateful for that.
Okay, well, thank you both. Really, what you've brought out, I think, to sum up, well, can't sum it all up, but just by way of conclusion, I think that you've brought forth the challenges and the benefits of the archaeological perspective in two cultures that are similar at times and different at times, and we've really spanned from antiquity, which in sometimes prehistoric times, to early historic times. But what you've also both shown, which is what's important, and I think both of our traditions, both of our communities have, is that we're invested in the ancient period. We're invested in this ancient history, and how we negotiate that, that's up for interpretation and experience. And but at the same time, it's a way of reconnecting not only to the ancient past, also to our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation. And I think that's very meaningful because it shows how through your studies you're kind of carrying on that chain. And so thank you both for being with us today at the Chinese-Jewish Conversation at Yeshiva University.